Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ana Reyes, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with SARAH Manguso, presenting her debut novel, Very Cold People. She is joined in conversation by Julie Orringer. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues as our spring lineup flourishes, which allows us to present authors and their work to our incredible community, especially on this digital platform. Find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from the comfort of your home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have an auto-generated closed caption available. Depending on the version of Zoom that you're using, you may need to enable your captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. If you would like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, in a moment, I'll be posting a link in the chat for Very Cold People available on our website. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight possible and help ensure the future of this landmark independent bookstore. Thank you all so much for showing up and tuning in support of authors, publishers, and indie book selling. We sincerely appreciate your support, especially now. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. So if they do, we'll just do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. SARAH Manguso is the author of 8 books. Her previous book, 300 Arguments, a genre-defined work of aphoristic nonfiction, was named a Best Book of the Year by more than 20 publications. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Hodder Fellowship, and the Rome Prize. Her work is regularly featured across the New York Times Magazine and the New Yorker, among others. Joining her on our digital stage this evening is Julie Orringer, the author of 3 award-winning books, How to Breathe Underwater, The Invisible Bridge, and most recently, The Flight Portfolio, soon to become a Netflix series. Tonight, they gather to discuss Very Cold People. SARAH has written a masterwork on growing up and in and out of a very small town. This haunting portrait of innocence lost and on the vulnerability of girlhood for readers who enjoy steady but intense storytelling, says Booklist. While New York Times hailed it that this novel definitely punches above its weight. With that, we are so pleased to be celebrating this book tonight. The digital podium is yours, SARAH and Julia.
Thank you so much, Ana, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is a really special event, not just because I get to speak with my good friend, Julie Orringer, but because my book takes place within feet or a couple of miles of Harvard Bookstore in an imaginary town called Waitsfield. So those of you who are local will know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to begin by just reading to you from the beginning of the book. I will read for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then Julie and I will chat. Chapter 1. My parents didn't belong in Waitsfield, but they moved there anyway. My mother answered the first knock at the door of the new house, expecting a casserole. We'd painted the house evening fog, she told me, but the woman from across the street wanted to know why we'd painted it purple like Italians. Some people wore their difference honestly, but my parents were liars, illegitimate Waitsfielders, their off-whiteness discovered only after the paint had dried. By the time I was born, the house had faded to the color of dirty snow. The oldest houses in Waitsfield were older than the town and bore plaques to mark their age. Generations of families had been born and died in them, and the town's 6 graveyards were populated mostly by children. Over the centuries, the slate stones had eroded and sunk in the dirt, and they looked like gray, crooked teeth inscribed with little lambs and angels. On the way to school, I walked past a 300-year-old mustard yellow salt box that my mother admired for its leaded glass windows and historically correct paint color. It probably had all the right antique fixtures inside, big sooty hearths and Indian shutters, visible proof of connection to the first best people. My mother referred to Western Massachusetts as out west, and I was mostly ignorant of the geography beyond our neighborhood. 3/4 of the town stayed unknown to me, and that mystery drummed up a sense of scale. To this day, I couldn't tell you how to get to the lodge school where the rich kids went. It was just there, somewhere, in those 10 square miles, not for me to find. I often asked my mother to drive us down to the part of town where every house had a plaque. It looked like a movie set. I knew a girl whose house had been used in a television ad for a clothing store. The ad was shot in the spring, and the crew had sprayed the lawn and the windowsills with sticky fake snow. At home, my mother cut out wedding announcements from the Courier, the only paper in town. Maybe the groom was a Cabot and the bride was an Emerson, and they sat on the boards of libraries and museums. My mother didn't know these people, but she liked the way they looked on our refrigerator. She also liked to study an old typeset record of the town's census, turning the well-handled pages as one would a beloved picture book. But there were no pictures, just lists of names and addresses. She cross-referenced the addresses with real estate listings in the Courier each week. Sometimes she took me to look at the big old houses. I never saw any people, just the houses, big Georgian colonials with widow's walks and little gabled windows like third eyes opening. I liked the estates too, especially Pond Road, which my mother told me was the most expensive street in town. Pond was a dead end, so it took some persuading to get my mother to drive the length of it and turn the car around. But when I reminded her that we'd never seen another soul walking or even driving around there, she could be tempted. Those houses weren't old, they were just enormous and ornate, with statuary and foreign-made cars. A couple of them were always under construction and hidden under blue tarps. I recognized the difference between the houses that were the oldest and those that were merely the most expensive. I liked the old houses, and I swooned over the girls and boys at school with names like Verity and Cornelius. I knew that I could never build the kind of relationship with money that the people in those stately, drafty, oldest houses enjoyed. I didn't even bother trying to infiltrate them. I worshiped them from a distance. In our house, the old paint on the windowsill had its own sweet smell, different from the wall paint. I felt all around the window sash to find a draft, but there was none. The cold was just everywhere. After the monthly mortgage payment, my parents had almost nothing left over, and we had to be careful. For one thing, the bathtub had to be filled to the height of my hand and no higher. I pressed my fingertips into the bottom of the tub, not knowing where my hand ended and my wrist began. One summer, I found a green garden hose on the ground next to a neighbor's house. The hose had been left on. I tried to calculate the amount of water that had been wasted. "What are we going to do?" I asked the other kids. They didn't answer. Adrenaline spilled into my blood. Water poured into the muddy ground. An old Irish cable knit cardigan with leather buttons hung in the downstairs coat closet, which smelled of hot farts and smoke. If anyone ever needed a sweater, they could go and put on the warming sweater, which was its name, as if other sweaters were merely decorative. My mother kept the house just cold enough for me to need to wear the warming sweater over my regular sweater, and she cut just enough plastic wrap to cover the diameter of a dish. I sat on the carpeted floor with my back against the radiator. It slowly bruised me, and if the heat came on, it turned my skin red in columns. A sheet of rigid plastic leaned between the radiator and the wall. It was meant to reflect heat back into the room. We had 2 sugar maples in the backyard, and my mother liked them best because their leaves turned bright red, the farthest possible from their original green. One of the maples got sick, and she hired a man to cut it down. She said that the man had come and started cutting, and that she'd stopped watching him, and that when he came back to the house to get paid, She looked again and saw that he'd cut down both maples, dead and gone. She would mourn those red trees the rest of her life. When I walked home from school, I picked up leaves that were gold speckled crimson, green-edged vermilion, purple black. I picked everything up, pebbles and matchbooks and little things people dropped. In December, I picked up evergreen branches and taped them to my bedroom door and made decorations, a little Christmas garland just for me. One day, my mother emptied my jacket pockets and found 2 half-used matchbooks and screamed at me. I could have started a fire, but I wouldn't have wasted a match to start a mere fire. I'd found what someone else had thought was trash, so I took it. 1 inch of rain equals 10 inches of snow, we all knew, but that had to be approximate since there were so many different combinations of snow and ground. I remember the metallic smell of it in the air before it fell, the pale blue of it on a clear morning, the soft thud of it falling, the powder of the coldest days, too cold to melt, squeaking at the boot, white, wet snow squeaking against my teeth, melting clear in the heat of my mouth. Snowfalls have unique bouquets. Snow isn't just frozen water, it carries a remnant of the sky. A blue hailstone tastes different from a white one because they've taken on air at different altitudes. We ate icicles not because they tasted good, but because they were a primal thing that could not be bought. To eat one was to dare someone to tell you it wasn't clean, that there was dirt in it, which we all knew. Everyone eats a peck of dirt in their life. And I'll stop there and welcome Julie back to the screen. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this book. It's just magical to hear you read those pages. I'm struck by just how quickly you achieve placemaking in all of the creative details of those lines. It's just incredible. And there's so many of them I want to ask you about individually, but I think what I'm going to begin with is a question about form, because over the course of your career, which I've had the privilege to watch for the last 17 years since we've known each other, I have known you to write collections of poetry, gorgeous memoirs, 300 Arguments, which is a kind of meditation on desire, relationships, art making, selfhood, and success. But until this book, not a novel. And though I notice between all of your books a kind of continuity of form that seems to move cleanly from one book to another and to advance a kind of general inquiry, there is a difference in this book. And I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about how you came to the idea that this particular material wanted to be explored as a novel, and about the process of writing a novel for the first time.
I like this question. Well, you saw early drafts of this book. I think by the time I showed it to you, though, it had already become fiction. But I mean, I remember well the internal resistance that I had to producing a novel. I just didn't think of myself as a fiction writer. And I was talking with Elizabeth McCracken about this last week, and I talked about arriving in Iowa to go to graduate school to be a poet and moving into a house with 4 fiction writers and just constantly observing these, what I felt were inherent differences between me and the fiction writers. But, you know, many of them were very easily legible. They all seemed to get up really early and write for long stretches. I would like spend half an hour writing a poem, and then that would be, almost enough work for the week. The poets didn't have a page count that we had to deliver weekly the way that the fiction writers did. And, there was this, as you know, having done the Iowa program a few years before me, there's this very strong division between the fiction writers and the poets, so much so that the poets cannot take the Fiction Writers Workshop and vice versa. And there's like, it almost feels like intermarriage when you date a fiction writer, which I never did. And,
it's kind of awkward how we're always like beating you guys at softball or bowling, I
not
understand.
when I was there, the poets destroyed the fiction writers. So, I mean, I can't speak for the poets who preceded me during your year. That's interesting. But yeah, it was something between a friendly rivalry and a violent aesthetic division between these two modes of writing. And then, of course, eventually you realize that writing is writing. And as I did, and, I wrote several books of prose that really did feel, as you pointed out, rather continuously to follow from the poems that I had begun as an emerging writer. And so I should also say that this Massachusetts material had been dormant in me since childhood, I guess. And it always felt like it was worthy of a book. And I attempted to write this book many times. I tried to write a book-length poem about 25 years ago. I tried it. I tried several times to write it as nonfiction. One as a memoir, which didn't work because I didn't have enough material, and again as a kind of like a researched sociological work, which didn't work because I'm not an academic and I didn't actually want to write it that way, but I just couldn't imagine how else to do it until it became incredibly obvious that it was necessary for me to explore some qualities of fiction that I had not had to appeal to before in dealing with the material that was more autobiographical. And the thing that, or the writing problem that I could not solve in nonfiction was the fact that, as some of you local New England people tuning in right now know, the culture that I was writing about, Massachusetts, a small town in Massachusetts in the late 70s and early 80s, it was really marked by blanknesses and omissions. There was not a lot of dialogue in this place. It's not Barcelona. It's not it's not Brooklyn. It's a quiet place where the content always seemed carefully curated to me, but the spare linguistic and visual content that I was writing about in establishing this place was also deeply suggestive. So I could record, if it had been a memoir, I could record what people had said and what had happened and what I saw and what I thought. But what I remembered suggested so much more of a story than had ever actually happened. And so that was sort of the rest of the iceberg of the story that didn't happen is what I think finally pushed this book over the edge from nonfiction into fiction. And I should say that you, along with so many other fiction writing friends for years, just said, why don't you just write a novel? And of course, if you haven't written a novel before and have never really written sustained fiction before, it's like, that is just an impossible thing to do. Not because it's that functionally different from writing a long book of nonfiction, but like, you can't just do that. And as well, we can talk more about genre, but I want to give you a chance to chime in too.
Well, I'm really glad that you bring up that point because a number of my students are here tonight from NYU. Actually, a number of my former continuing studies students from Stanford are here too, which is amazing. But a
lot of smarties in the audience tonight.
But my class at NYU right now is about that feeling exactly, that it's so very difficult to write a novel. It's so different from writing short fiction or from writing poetry or from writing essays. And that sense of continuity you're talking about is part of the difficulty. But I think another part of it may be the challenge of manipulating story over the course of that longer narrative, those multiple threads that have to be braided together and come to some accretive meaning. So I guess, well, the next question I want to ask you is really about this novel's relationship to narrative shape or to plot. Here is what some of your many laudatory reviews have had to say about this novel's relationship to plot. Alexandra Jacobs in the New York Times said, "So masterly is Manguso at making beauty of boring old daily pain that when more dramatic plot turns arrive, suicides, teen pregnancies, they seem almost superfluous." Katie Waldman said, "The most significant incidents, a slap, a seduction, a suicide, exist only as rumors, referred to after the fact, and the material that does make it to the page behaves like anti-narrative. Manguso's method is to break narrative into wisps of inner life and bits of observation." That was from her review in The New Yorker. Rebecca Steinitz in the Boston Globe said, "Manguso is an exquisitely astute writer, and there is something admirable about her refusal to bow to predictable plot tropes that might rescue Ruthie more definitively." But this approach to the narrative shape of the book, this idea that you wanted the narrative shape to develop organically and to allow its events to accrue meaning rather than structuring them sort of artificially around a series of causally connected events, that was one that you came to over the course of writing drafts. That wasn't something that just landed in your mind at the beginning of the creation of this book. So I just want to hear you talk a bit about that trajectory, about your sort of original conception of what the book should be and what its relationship to plot might be and what it turned into over time.
This is slightly embarrassing to confess, but in the beginning, I thought a novel had to have a dramatic plot. Again, hearkening back to Iowa, I remember the day that Frank Conroy told all the fiction writers, dramatize, dramatize, dramatize. I must have taken it in some way, because, certainly I'd been reading fiction throughout my reading life, and I knew intellectually and, in a deep way that, there are so many different ways to create a novel. You can make a novel out of exposition like David Markson, or you can, there are many examples of novels that flout the sort of, Hollywood conventions of the three acts and the big conflicts and then the big apotheosis at the end. But I still had this artificial understanding that, not only was I not really a fiction writer, but that I had this idea of what a fiction writer was and what a novel was that was incredibly artificial and did not bear really any resemblance to what I knew they could be. And so those early drafts really did feel as if I were wearing a costume. I had put on my fiction writer costume and wrote a book that didn't really resemble, the sort of thing that I would ever write. And I had to waste quite a bit of time writing in that mode before I realized, this is just the next book by me, the person who has written books, and that, and in the end, the draft that finally satisfied me really doesn't differ too much tonally or formally from any of my other books. And it's, it's funny that I in the end, procedurally, the way that I put the narrative together, it was very similar to the way that I had procedurally put together my nonfiction books, which are, I feel a little bit like I've gotten away with something when somebody, calls the the chronology of one of my books, skillfully crafted, because that, I'm not skillfully crafting it. Like all I'm doing is putting these things together, putting these little components, these building blocks of language together in a way that resembles the actual world as I experience it. So there's no, I hear the accusation or praise of putting it together in an unconventional way as as like a skill or an achievement or something artificial that I'm like trying to do, but it really feels very different from trying. It feels more like just make this thing look like the other thing being the actual world.
Yeah, I mean, I remember you saying to me at a certain point, I'm just going to do what I do.
I know. How long did it take me to be able to say that to you?
It took 2 years.
Yeah, it took a couple years. Yeah. I love that you know that.
When we talk about when we talk about you doing what you do as a writer, I know your work well enough to know what you mean by that, but can you talk about what that is? I mean, you've mentioned not deliberately shaping these sections in a particular way or feeling like you're simply observing the world, but I want to talk about some really concrete things that I notice in your work. The book is told in short sections. The sections are not necessarily directly related narratively. The book is composed of very short paragraphs, some of which are only a sentence long. One reviewer mentioned these snowy white spaces between the sections. It was interesting to me to read that, actually, because there was a kind of implication of coldness separating those sections, but I kind of experienced it in the opposite way. I've always experienced this in your work in the opposite way, as a kind of like compassion. I've given you something to think about, and now I'm going to give you a moment to consider it. I'm just going to go silent for a moment so that you can take it in before I say something else. But what are the other things? Like what are your practices for those of us who are not as familiar with your work?
I went into this reverie when you referred to the reading of the white space on the page as cold or as snowy. I love your reading of it as compassion. I just think of it as like a necessary break. Like there's so much content, there's so much to engage with. And then I thought, like, oh, what if pages weren't white? Like, what if they were? Okay, we don't need to talk about that, but that's what I was just thinking about. I read an interview with the brilliant writer Patricia Lockwood earlier today, in which she was talking about the way that she engages with, reads, and writes plot or narrative. And for those who don't know, she is a writer who began as a poet, is now a seasoned prose writer. She has an amazing memoir called Priest Daddy and published her first novel recently. And something she said in the interview that really caused my heart to beat faster was the fact that when she absorbs a long narrative, a film or a novel, she doesn't remember what happened. And like, this has been a secret shame of mine since middle school. Like I will not remember the end of the movie. Like, give me 48 hours, it's gone. But the way that I remember things, I think is, it's unusual, but it is really the core reason that I write in the way I do, in these small compositional units, in these, rather than like an arcing narrative. I'll have like, imagining it as a mosaic, I'll have like, 4 or 5 little bits of the mosaic, enough to suggest the remainder of the mosaic, but I couldn't possibly do the whole thing. And so Patricia Lockwood goes on to say that, maybe there's like some attention deficit issues or some like, autism spectrum issues. And, I've definitely wondered if neurologically there's something going on with my brain as well, just in the way that I remember and the way that I as a consequence of the way I remember, the way I write. But I really do take all of the existing data that I have. That sounds very scientific, but I take everything that I know of the place or of the feeling or of the event that I have decided to write about, and I write it all down. And I think, my brain is the one who should get the credit, because I put no effort into selecting these, like carefully selected details. It's just all that I remember. I just have a real problem hanging on to whole stories. And it's something that's perhaps related to this is the fact that if you've seen my house before, but like I don't have a lot of objects in my house. And I have always preferred to live that way. I don't have anything on my desk. You're always sort of, as a writer, you're often asked questions like, oh, what's on your desk right now? And I so love reading about writers' desks that have, contain things that they've collected over 30, 40 years, and everything means something. There's no meaning on my desk. It's clean. I Windex it. That's it. I would like to call out my mother, who is in the audience, who kept house very, very similarly to the way that I do now. And I mean, it may have been a key ingredient in my ultimate aesthetic in the kind of art that I make.
I love that. I love that idea of how one's home environment might influence one's work many years later.
I mean, mustn't it somehow?
Yes, I would say that the same is true in my case. Along those same lines, I want to talk a little bit about Waitsfield and the place it occupies within this narrative, which is really it's like it permeates everything in the book. It's not the place where the book is set. It is the medium in which the book lives. When I read an early draft of the book, it began with Winifred's house. Winifred is the original owner of this house that Ruthie's family ends up moving into, and with Winifred's position within the town's hierarchy, and with a pile of mysteriously stained clothes in the attic crawl space of this house. Can you talk about, either narratively speaking or in reality, what it was that intrigued you about those places, both the house and the town, and those particular objects?
Yes. I would love to talk a little bit about Winifred. I think you've very well described the way that Waitsfield functions in the book. Winifred is the owner of the house that the protagonist Ruthie and her parents move into when Ruthie is 13, so about a third of the way through the book. And Ruthie knows a few things about Winifred, that she had a husband who disappeared, that she lived alone in the house after her two sons grew up and left home, and that she died in the house, and for that reason the house was inexpensive. I began with the Winifred pages. Like I really, one of the times that I started over completely and began this novel from page one, I think it was the second or third time, I began with Winifred thinking that the entire book would be about her, that maybe it would be a period piece. Winifred builds the home in the 1920s, and it would be this like multi-generational thing, because I thought, again, I was trying to think of think of the most conventional way that you could tell a story. So it's like, oh yeah, a period piece in Massachusetts with characters and costumes and parties and things. And I got about 5 or 6 pages, and then I became completely inured to anything that had interested me about this character just stopped interesting me. but I didn't want to let it go either because it seemed very important. And she was this sort of, I mean, this character kind of haunts the house as Ruthie experiences the house. She feels Winifred there, although of course she had never met her, and she finds a few artifacts that may or may not have belonged to Winifred, the perhaps blood-stained or paint-stained clothes, the antique dirty pictures. And so for a long time, the Winifred pages were kind of this island in the middle of what eventually became Ruthie's story. Ruthie, I fairly soon after that, I realized that Ruthie was in fact the protagonist and that she was telling the story. And then I realized that Winifred was just someone that Ruthie imagines. Ruthie has, it is, you'll notice some autobiographical similarities between me and Ruthie, but Ruthie has a couple of photographs. She has the clothes. She lives in the house. There are a few lamps that she knew Winifred must have actually touched with her hands. But other than that, there's no story. But Ruthie makes the story out of those, and she does a really good job. I mean, she comes up with this narrative of sexual predation in which the roles that Ruthie observes in the actual world around her are reversed because the woman is the predator. And so in Ruthie's imagination, she comes up with this whole story about how the Lowell boy next door painted the doors on Winifred's house, and then Winifred invites him in, and then at the beginning of this whole thing. And Ruthie kind of indulges in this story during what was a somewhat traumatic time, puberty, and this, very cold, very, very, very silent, but this muffled, this snow muffled and culture muffled place. And her way of coping with it was to imagine this story of somebody else in a different time, somebody who was, in a way free of what was happening around Ruthie in the moment.
But it's so cool to hear you talk about it that way, to talk about the way in which Ruthie had to sort of create this person's story, because in effect, that's what she's doing with all of the women she's close to in this novel. I mean, it's what she does with the friends who she's closest to, Amber, Bea, and Charlie. And ultimately, it's what she does with her mother as well, whose life she's at a loss to understand earlier in the book. But I'd love to have you talk about the role of these girls in the book, the girls who constellate around Ruthie, and who are increasingly imperiled as the book develops. I guess there are a couple of questions I have. One is about how Ruthie and her friends manifest their social class differently. And then another has to do with the way they communicate through objects that they trade back and forth among them. Can we talk about those three girls and how they kind of constitute this powerful square with Ruthie in the book?
Yes, there are three girls, Amber, Bea, and Charlie, each of whom belongs to a slightly different part of the social pecking order of the town. In rough terms, Amber is poorer than Ruthie. Bea is at about the same place, and Charlie is of a higher social class. It's interesting to think of them as a square, or as is, Amber, Bea, and Charlie each relate to Ruthie in their own way, and each relationship with Ruthie is distinct from the others. And they're not a group, they're four individual girls. And that was important to me in order to just describe the essential isolation that all of these girls, that really, the town depended on their isolation, their lived isolation from all of the other girls and all the other adults and the people in charge. And, something that was constantly in different ways made known to the girls from the people who should have been in charge of keeping them safe was that when any kind of predatory event involved any of the girls, they were told to perceive it as anomalous. That's just one thing. That's just once in a lifetime thing. But if they had had the data, they would have seen that the abuse was not the plot. The abuse was the background. The abuse was the setting, and the abuse was also inseparable from the culture of the town and the geography of the town and the climate of the town. It was so strong. It was such a strong force, and none of the girls alone could ever fight back against it. But the way that Ruthie starts to be able to extricate herself from Waitsfield is that she creates the story of Winifred. And in a way, like, I see it as the metaphysical the sort of imagined beginning of Ruthie's escape, because she's imagining Winifred escaping, the culture, before she can imagine herself even attempting to do something like that. And so she's, Ruthie doesn't always understand what's happening to her, and she is not always aware of what it means when things happen to her friends either. She's just kind of taking in the data that's legible to her, while, the reader sees more than Ruthie does. I mean, that's kind of the lovely thing about first person, because you have the information, you have the protagonist observing, talking about, and presenting the information. And then, you as the reader are observing the protagonist not getting everything. And so, yeah, I would say that's one of the narrative functions of the girls. The objects, the objects, again, were just, they just very much characterized what I do remember of the late 70s and early 80s. They were just, there were precious objects in that time. I was born in 74. So friendship pins and scratch and sniff stickers and little
everything smelling like strawberries.
Everything smelling like strawberries, little rope bracelets, those things were very precious. There was no, we weren't like going online and ordering things from different states and countries. It was, what we had was very local. And, and it became, it was a thing to be from Massachusetts, because you had different stuff from people in Ohio or Florida or California. Whereas now it's, you're sort of your time. You're not really as much, at least if you're living in a developed country, you're like not that much of your place as I think, as we definitely were as Gen X kids.
But I think I also felt, reading this book, especially in this current draft, just how much is invested in those objects. There's this watch that Ruthie sends away for after having collected these Tropicana orange juice labels.
I had that watch, I should say.
You had that watch?
Autobiographical, yes.
Okay, so on the face of this watch are orange slices, and each slice represents a 5-minute interval. And there was something about the precision with which that object was described, and with which, numerous objects in this novel are described, that felt to me like they were invested with a kind of, hope and almost a kind of spiritual importance, like in the absence of the emotional warmth that Ruthie feels the lack of in the town, and more specifically in her life. It's almost as if she's employing these objects, and not just Ruthie, but the other girls who we meet in the book as well, including Ruthie's mother, are employing these objects as repositories of care in a way that cannot turn around and hurt them. And I just wondered if this investiture of meaning was something that was deliberate in the book, or if this was something that sort of just came out of the recreation of a feeling or of memory from childhood, or how that relationship between emotion and object came about here.
I love that reading. I hadn't considered it. And as I'm sure, you and others in the audience know, it's just, it's uniquely validating to hear something from a reader, from somebody consuming the art that you make, that you didn't know about the art before. And that's definitely something like, so the objects standing in for almost religious artifacts. What's it called when you have like a part of a saint?
Relics.
A relic, yeah. So they almost have like a reliquary
Yeah.
importance. Something that I've observed in my own offspring is that children are, or at least from my perspective, children are frequently, extraordinarily generous with each other vis-a-vis their objects. Like so many times I've seen my son or one of his friends admire, somebody admires an object, a little toy that the other is playing with. And then toy is given to the admirer of the toy. And every time it happens, I think, wow, so there's been a really profound energy exchange here. It's just so heavy with meaning when that happens, and so incredibly heavy with love and history. And it's like you're giving the whole history of this object has a new life now in a new context, and the narrative continues. I mean, there have been whole books written about objects like this. So I wasn't aware that I was depicting that. Really, I was remembering the sorts of objects that loomed large in my memory of this time. Not just of this time in history, but this time in my life. Being that age and that time. So that a Girl Scout badge was a big deal.
Absolutely.
Again, it's very, I think it's most difficult to communicate that, that incredible power that objects had to people who grew up after the internet age, who will just not ever understand that scarcity. It's not poverty, it's just scarcity. It's just a different relationship to objects, period. It seems so fundamentally different from the way that at least I personally deal with objects now. Like I can always get another one. Or like if there's an out of print book, I will find that book on the internet and have it. You sent me this amazing out of print book that I read obsessively over and over so many times and took out of my elementary school library so many times that I wasn't allowed to take it out again. Dollhouse Magic. And I now possess a hardcover copy of Dollhouse Magic.
Yes, this is a book about, for the uninitiated, how to make tiny furniture and plates of food and objet d'art out of common household objects.
Yes, but they were the common household objects of the 70s and 80s, though, like a wooden spool. Oh, you had tons of those, but you would be hard pressed to find a wooden spool nowadays, I think, in the average household. I want to make sure we have time to respond to some of these questions that
we have some great questions in the chat, in the Q&A. I love this one. As you began to write, who along the way gave you permission to be a writer and exercise your voice?
Wow. Well, the teacher in me, and really, I mean, if I'm answering this with all honesty, no one can give you that permission except yourself. And my dear friends tried to give it to me, as we try to give things to our dearest friends. But I mean, there were certain internal shifts that need to take place completely privately. You unfortunately, or at least I've found that I cannot obtain real permission to make any kind of art from any external force.
That's a great answer. What poetic impulses do you think served you well while writing this novel? It's a marvelous question.
Oh, that's a great question. My first knee-jerk response is, well, all of them. They're all good. They're all useful. And then my second response is, well, what are poetic impulses and how are they discernible from prose impulses, if prose and poetry are even in disagreement with each other aesthetically? And then my third and final answer is, I don't really know what a poetic impulse is. You know, if I had to define that right now, I'm not sure how I would, you know, label an impulse, a creative impulse, as distinctly poetic. I'm sorry.
Well, one of the things that that I sometimes talk to my students about in relation to your work, and also in relation to the work of other writers who are poets but who also write prose, is the careful choice that seems to attend every word, and also a kind of commitment to, or maybe a natural impulse toward economy and brevity. And I know that this is something that you've lectured about in the past, so maybe we can talk about that for a moment.
Yeah, I think there are very few ways in which I would place writers into two categories, but one of them is definitely writers who are short form writers and writers who are not short form writers. You are not a short form writer. Julie Orringer is the author of two novels of, how many pages are they? I mean, I know this is a very intimate question to be asking in public, but how long are they? 600?
600 and 700 pages.
6 and 7, okay. And they're, you know, very easily digested. Like, you are a long form writer. That is the appropriate form in which you make your work. I am a short form writer. I couldn't possibly figure out how to write a 700-page book. Although right now, I just started reading An American Childhood by Dillard. I know it's not cool, but I absolutely love Dillard, and she writes the kind of prose that I aspire to write, and she feels, you know, kindred to me, at least aesthetically. And she is not a short form writer. Her prose has the density of, I mean, I guess poetry, or good poetry. You know, or I should say, her prose has the density that a much shorter book could get away with. But her books are not short, and so they take me forever to read. But they're incredibly potent. Maybe it's potency that we're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah, distill, like, you know, it's like a distilled essence. Yeah, all I can say is that I've just always felt like I've you know, it seemed a natural expression for me to make a short text.
Here's another question that I'm fascinated by. I grew up in small town Massachusetts, and your Waitsfield feels much truer to me than the versions of Massachusetts I've seen in fiction or pop culture. This is a strange question, but as you wrote this, did it feel like you were a whistleblower on towns like Waitsfield? How did it feel to try to get the character of that place down on paper?
Oh, that's so validating. Thank you for that question. Thank you for the praise in that question. Did I feel like a whistleblower? I don't know that I would necessarily use that term, but certainly there, you know, one of the impulses behind writing the book is that I felt there was so much about Massachusetts that I knew that I had not seen articulated elsewhere. I mean, I mean, isn't that really the impulse? Like, we don't want to make things that are already in the world. We want to make things that are new, that you know, that I feel like I need, and that I can't find elsewhere. You know, it's sort of almost like a greeting card bit of advice that, you know, writing teachers give on lazier days. But, you know, write the book that you want to read. Yeah, so I'll just say simply that this is what I remember. And yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that there, you know, Boston has been there, like, for a while, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, there was a moment when like every Hollywood movie took place in Boston, took place on, you know, Cape Cod or Boston or somewhere in Massachusetts. And it was like, you know, it was such a moment, and everybody was doing Boston accents, and it just seemed like very fashionable. But of course, there were conventional ways that Massachusetts was represented. And then, you know, the more Hollywood movies that were made, you know, the harder those conventions be, you know, they sort of crystallized, and it became impossible to make a movie about Massachusetts that didn't kind of echo all of the other work about Massachusetts. And the fact that I had never managed to write about it before, I think allowed all of that material, all of that remembered sensory data to kind of come out all together. I hadn't really distributed it through my other books. I mean, a sentence here and there, but you know, the vast majority of that memory was just dormant in me, untouched.
A related question here. To what extent do you think this ethos of old Massachusetts still exists in 2022? And how has it evolved perhaps since Ruthie's time in the novel?
I couldn't say, only because I left Massachusetts in 1997, and I have not been back for any real duration since then. I don't know. If we were all in the bookstore, which I hope we all can do at some point before long, we could all talk about this afterward.
I would love to be privy to that conversation too. And the final question on the list here is an interesting one to me. How did you get your fiction writer costume off as you got into later stages of the writing process here? This question assumes that you got your fiction writer costume off as you got into the later stages of the writing process, which is it's interesting because it kind of, the question seems to be about what are elements of craft that you had to bring to the revision of this book that were not necessarily specific to fiction writing, but that were just, you know, applications of what you knew as a writer, that you had sort of accrued as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
In your...
Yeah, I mean, it sounds pat, but I realized there was no such thing as a fiction writer. There was just a writer who was, yeah.
I love that. I'm so glad to hear you say that.
Yeah, I know it to be true, at least for me.
Well, it was just so, oh, there's one more. This one's from my student, Amy. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we've got a minute. Let's do it.
As you wrote, did you feel as if you were writing toward a specific ending, or did you arrive at and then discover the ending?
I had no idea how the book would end, and I worried that it didn't have an ending, and it took a while to figure out the ending. So the answer is, you know, absolutely not. And I hate having an idea of what an ending is. I'm immediately bored when that happens. So I never know what the ending is.
Well, this was such an incredible pleasure to hear you speak about the book.
I can't thank you enough, Julie.
But
thank you.
You know, as much as we've talked about it and as well as we know each other, it's just like an incredible series of discoveries each time I hear you talk about your work. So thank you for being so forthcoming about your craft and about your thought. It's just such a delight.
Thank you for all of your incredibly careful preparation, which I can hear in every sentence that you utter.
And thank you both so much for coming. Sarah and Julie, what a beautiful conversation, truly. Thank you for sharing that with all of us. And thank you to everyone out there spending your evening with us. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Mass, keep reading, stay safe, be well, and have a lovely rest of your week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.